When I was watching all of that Patrice Colors stuff for yesterday's video, I came across this clip during one of her interviews.
Who's being impacted the most by COVID-19? The poor. Who's being impacted the most by COVID-19? Black folks, Latinx folks.
Yeah, this is how I know she's fake. Only astroturfed, politically correct talking heads actually use Latinx. Latinx as a term is a bastardization of Latina and Latino. Spanish, being a more gendered language than English, uses these two terms to refer to the male and female forms of Latin individual. Adding X is an English neologism. In the English language, X is often used to refer to an unknown variable, a practice that got its start in mathematics. It later made the jump over to pop culture in the 80s and 90s to refer to something that is just not known. See Mega Man games happening in 2000 and X, for example. Yeah, it turned out that it doesn't matter what number you put in there. We didn't have robot Shotas at all in the 2000s. Maybe Mega Man X will be more on the nose. They use 20xdx. The usage here is that it's some unknown time in the future. It's a deliberate vagueness of when the events take place. The purpose of it allows the author to buy themselves a bit more time and extend the realism of the story. Oh, it's 2022 and that future event didn't happen? Well, rather than writing 2022, if you write 20xdx, it can happen any time between now and 2099, extending the plausibility of the story. This is ultimately the problem with Star Trek's canon. When the show debuted in the 60s, it made sense that the eugenics wars happened in the 1990s and the Third World War happened in the 2040s, but nowadays it seems kind of absurd. Though if you listen to enough Tim Pool, it sounds like we might still get that Third World War. Cross your fingers for a nuclear holocaust, Trekkies. But the use of X to refer to unknown data filtered down into Latinx. If you wanted to talk about a crowd of Latino and Latina people, the progressives would demand that you use Latinx as a simple shorthand, since saying Latino and Latina was kinda clunky. After the rising popularity of trans activism in the early 2010s, and more recently, the direct co-opting of that movement by non-binary, genderqueer, and weird dear gender people, the X in Latinx began to refer to people who did not view themselves as Latino or Latina. And so, Latinx began to be pushed, not only for use to identify a mixed gender crowd, but to include other gender identities as well. Unfortunately, it turns out that the vast majority of Latinx people fucking hate the term. Poll finds Latinx people don't like to be called Latinx. Despite this monumental effort to be inclusive, it may fall on deaf ears, at least with Latinx voters. A recent survey conducted by market research agency Think Now found that nearly half, 44%, of Latinx people polled prefer the term Hispanic, which somebody, maybe Elizabeth Warren, should probably tell them is extremely problematic due to its imperialist origins. 24% of respondents preferred Latino or Latina, also problematic. 11% preferred the name of their country of origin. 7% preferred their country of origin plus American. 6% preferred just American. 5% preferred Chicano and Chicana. And just 2% of respondents preferred the term Latinx. This is always the case, isn't it? Progressives at the top claim to speak for a whole class of people, while that class actually rejects them. Socialists for the working class, BLM for black people, and now this. This was steady across all demographics. We went into it with the hypothesis that awareness was always going to be lower than social media makes it seem, said Mario Xavier Carasso, the co-founder of Think Now. We didn't think it was going to be as low as it is. We also thought that it was going to be significantly more popular among young people, and it's not. There's no significant difference there. In fact, the researchers found that just 3% of the respondents under 35 preferred Latinx, and 97% preferred anything else. Clearly, the progressive media establishment and the Democratic candidates for president have a lot more educating to do. Is this a parody article? I can't tell. To me, it kind of sounds like it, but I wouldn't actually put it past a prog writer to unironically say something like, "We need to educate the dirty, unwashed Latinx underclass to accept our proper progressive inclusive framing." Carasso says they're going to follow up this survey with another one asking if Latinx people are actually offended by this term, or if they're just unaware of it. But for some, including Giancarlo Sopo, a contributor to USA Today, the answer is obvious. It's offensive. Gender non-conforming Americans should be treated with compassion and respect, he wrote. If someone wants to be called Latinx, that's fine, but the label should not be forced upon all Latinos. Hispanic Americans face plenty of challenges. The last thing we need are progressives woke-splaining how to speak Spanish. And this is the core of the problem. Most people view this as an English colonization of the Spanish language. It's an English practice to put X to refer to an unknown variable. Neopronouns are an English phenomenon. Latinx is unpronounceable in Spanish because X is used differently. That's why they say Mexico and not Mexico. X conjugates with the previous vowel to make a new sound. Well, conjugates? That's with verbs. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? When a vowel's sound changes because there are other consonants and vowels around, you know what I'm talking about. The point is, unlike Mexico, there's no previous vowel in Latinx. The letter's an N, so it just doesn't work. Hispanics don't view Latinx as inclusive. They view it as colonialism. Hell, not even English people like it. During the Radfem days 10 to 15 years ago, there was a push to use Womxn, as well as Womyn, woman with a Y, to distinguish woman from man. The idea being that woman is a root of the word man in English, but women should be their own strong, beautiful, powerful class, not defined in relation to men, but fierce on their own right. But nowadays, Womxn is used to include trans women in the name of inclusivity, and most trans women fucking hate it. Nobody wants this progressive bullshit, but if you object, of course you're transphobic. Right. The joke has become so widespread that we're now seeing Italianx in response to it. There's been a pretty prolific meme that Italians aren't actually white people, generally referring to how Italians, and the Irish as well, were treated in the United States shortly after a large migration of their population there, as well as the idea that there was a gradual intermixing between the Southern Europeans and the African and Arab populations due to the history of the Mediterranean Sea. As a very generalized statement, Southern Europeans have more Mediterranean physical features than what was considered white at the time, which was the Northern and Central European standard you could find in Britain, France, Germany, and the Nordic countries. In the United States, however, Irish and Italians gradually integrated and became accepted as white. And frankly, the same process is happening now to a lot of the Hispanic community. But Italianx, or Italx, leans heavily on the absurdity of Latinx, on the idea that a group that is undergoing an integration process and that is becoming more white, that already uses a European language and has a lot of white ancestry, for some reason needs to invent a new word that nobody actually likes to describe itself, in the name of diversity, inclusion, equity. But fine, let's just keep the trend up. How about Frenchx? Britex? Germixn? Actually, Germixn was unironically used in a progressive Discord in the name of preventing the inhabitants from being triggered at the sight of the word man. Can we use Gayx to make being gay more inclusive? How about Twinks? There we go. Can we use SonicX to refer to furries? That was actually a pretty good show back in the day. In 2009, when this channel was all about anime, we actually did a review of it, if you want to go see Babby SFO. Imagine being at the grocery store. You see a comic you read as a kid, and the nostalgia washes over you. Why not? You got a few bucks to spare. You pick it up and decide to check it out when you're at home, wondering what your old hero idols are up to in the latest storylines. And as you flip through the pages, you see Latinx propaganda. But actually, it's pretty realistic propaganda, because it features a white woman explaining to a Latina why she should be using Latinx, how it's more inclusive, and this newly converted Latinx person sagely nods along with this white-splaining, her brown body thoroughly colonized, her tiny Latin brain mind-fucked by this person's white superiority. At the end of the comic, the new convert demands dignity for all Latinx folk. The irony apparently lost on the creator of the comic, of talking about dignity while openly using Latinx. Also, where the fuck are the superheroes? These panels are from the new Spider-Man book. That redhead is apparently Spider-Girl. Where's the fucking superheroes? Even though nobody likes this garbage, especially the people who it's meant for, Latinx isn't going away. Pop culture is pushing it like mad, and it doesn't stop with Latinx. Filipinx was recently used by a Riot Games developer to describe a new character in Valorant, to a huge backlash across the gaming space. Filipinx was received far worse than Latinx, and the woman ended up apologizing for it, because Filipino people took it as a racial slur. Unlike Spanish, in Tagalog, Filipino applies to both guys and girls, so it can't even rely on the one flimsy justification that Latinx has. Let's bring things around full circle. At the beginning of the video, I quoted an article that mentioned a Chicano/Chicana identity. Chicano is an identifier used by people of Mexican descent who were born in the United States. The Mexican-American identity appeared as more Latinos began to assimilate into American culture, becoming analogous to Black American and Italian American and all the others. The Chicano identity was formed as a reaction to most Latino people's desire to assimilate, and nowadays, Chicano is used to refer to an anti-assimilationist Mexican element that often aligns itself with the Black Panthers and other supremacist and separatist organizations. The Chicanos and Chicanas created their own form of X, one by them, for them, and compatible with their own language. Llanisma, there was no way I'm pronouncing this word correctly, so it's on screen. There are some Mexicans who still speak native pre-colonization languages. And Mexican Spanish has also inherited some traits from those native languages that mainline Spanish lacks. One of them is determining gender by adjusting sound at the beginning of a word. And unlike Latinx, it's actually pronounceable in Spanish if you place an X in that spot. This has the same effect of putting the X at the end of the word in English. It degenders it, it adds that variable quality to it, and it makes it more inclusive. As such, a lot of Chicano people began calling themselves Xianos. In the 2010s, the Xiano and Chicano identities finally impacted with modern social justice. And you know what happened to them? Yeah, Chicano got turned into Chicanx. To wrap it back around, the father of Patrice Concolor's kid from both the start of this video and featured in yesterday's for being part of the money laundering, during that podcast that no one's ever heard of, yeah, he used Chicanx there too.
My brother Daniel French was also invited to this conversation, who's in a band called Las Cafeteras. Phenomenal Chicanx band.
It sounds literally like Chicken X. And even more hilariously, Xiano became Xianx. It's already got a fucking X in it, you numbskulls. Xianx? How about we add another one in there just to make it more inclusive? Xanax, why not? Maybe you guys are all taking fucking Xanax if you think any of this shit makes any sense. Xbox Live was full of racism despite how many X's it had. Why don't we just make all the letters X? 6 X's. XXX. There you go. It's the most inclusive possible thing, because nobody even knows what it says anymore. Does this mean that white people can't act in porn anymore because it's XXX? Does this mean that all those racist cartoons showing drunk black people with bottles of booze, because they had XXX on the bottle, it's not actually racism, it's just inclusivity? In fact, that actually seems to be the case with most progressivism. Every attempt of progs to be inclusive always just ends up with them being fucking racists. The entire thing seems arbitrary. I made a previous video about the history of adding stars to words in order to censor them, because the words themselves were offensive, like replacing the A in Nazi with a star symbol, and how that spread to hilarious censorship efforts, like censoring actual people's names like Sargon or the Cordring or Sophia Narwitz or whoever else. If the same logic applied here, it would mean that Latino or Filipino or woman were themselves offensive terms. But they're actually not. The removal of a letter and replacing it with a meaningless symbol, in this instance, is for the sake of inclusivity rather than censorship, even though it's the same thing functionally, because in the end, progressives view censorship and inclusivity as the same thing. If you think about it, this actually makes sense. Being pro-free speech means risking being offensive and hearing offensive things. It means being tolerant of offensive speech. The progressive drive towards inclusivity has always at its core been anti-free speech. This is one of the other reasons that Hispanic people are rejecting Latinx, aside from it just being plain old racist like we discussed earlier. And the left seems to be determined to shoot themselves in the foot when it comes to Hispanic people. The Democrats are already losing the growing Hispanic vote to the Republicans, as your average Hispanic voter is family, church, and community oriented. All values that Republicans appeal to more than Democrats. Hispanic voters are also often tough on illegal immigration. They often view the police favorably, and they're not that interested in race politics, all of which are positions that clash with the progressive narrative. Latinx might be the final nail in the coffin regarding Hispanic support for leftist politics, but it's certainly not the only one. It's all just so performative. Nobody wants this, nobody cares. It's just a way to make progs feel good about themselves, and for them to virtue signal to other progs about how morally righteous they are. And the proper response that we should take is the same as every other time something stupid like this happens. Laugh at them. You can debate them if you want, but they're just gonna scream about inclusivity, so instead make fun of them. Let them know that they are a joke. Because they are.
Démosle pues. Latinx